Chapter 2. Keeping a Promise. With the princess's note tucked in the pocket of his vest, Chris quickly made his way out of the marketplace and toward the ranch of Rudy Chesterton, located right outside Calico Village, where most of the residents of Silverbell resided. He would be late for his chores at the farm at which he worked, but it would have to wait. What could be more important than fulfilling a promise to the royal family? When Chris arrived at the ranch, he found the workers attending to the horses in the open field, located in the center of the property and surrounded by a tall fence. Chris ran up to the fence and called upon one of the workers whom he recognized. "Hey, Sam, is your boss around?" Sam turned around from grooming one of the horses and shook his head. "Afraid not, old boy," he replied. "Mr. Chesterton is conducting some business to the east today. Should be back by nightfall, though." Chris sighed and slumped his shoulders in disappointment. "Something I can do for you?" Sam asked, witnessing Chris's disappointment in his initial reply. Chris looked up at the sky, deep in thought, and then fixed his eyes upon Sam. "Tell him I will call on him tonight," Chris said finally. "Will do," Sam confirmed, and he returned to his work. Chris made his way out of the ranch, though not with the same speed and excitement with which he had entered. He had to admit to himself, he was extremely curious about what was written on the note that now rested inside his pocket. And had the princess said something about the shepherds? Could she be referring to the Dowry family that cared for the kingdom's only flock of sheep? He tried not to think any more about it, for fear that his curiosity would become overwhelming and he would be tempted to break the promise he had made to the princess. As Chris made his way to the ranch where his presence was overdue, he heard a familiar voice call out to him. Crossing the small bridge over the stream that ran alongside the Chesterton ranch was Chris's closest friend, Jack. He was the kingdom's iceman, and was in fact at that moment pulling along a mule-drawn wagon filled with ice to be delivered to the castle. He wore somewhat tattered clothing, but he never seemed to mind that his appearance made him look poorer than he actually was. He was a skinny man with stubble on his face and a head of dark black hair, which was partially covered by the short top hat he always wore. Chris smiled as he saw Jack approach. "What are you doing out here?" Jack teased as he approached Chris with his wagon. "Doesn't old man Elpert have you locked up with a ball and chain during the day?" Chris shrugged playfully. "Well, it sure beats lugging around a frozen rock." Jack looked back at his wagon inquisitively. "Is my mom back there?" Chris chuckled. "Where are you headed, my friend?" "Castle," Jack answered. "Special delivery for the king." "Well, ice is ice, so I don't know how special it is." Chris thought for a moment. "Do you ever see or talk to any of the royal family when you make these deliveries?" Jack shook his head. "Nah, I drop off everything by a back door. Never any interaction with anyone besides a servant and a few guards." "Why?" "Oh, no reason," Chris quickly replied. "Just curious." Jack looked over at the castle in the distance. "Maybe today, though, Princess Ava will greet me personally. You never know." A large, goofy smile immediately appeared on Chris's face at the mention of the princess's name. Jack looked at him suspiciously. "She might greet me," Jack repeated slowly with emphasis. "Not you, smiley boy." Chris's smile refused to leave his face, though he admittedly was making no effort to remove or hide it. "Well," Chris replied, "like you said, you never know." While the smile did not leave Chris's face, the suspicious look also did not leave Jack's. "I gotta get going before all your hot air melts the king's special ice," Jack quipped. "But I want an explanation for all—" He waved his hand in front of Chris's face. "This." Jack threw the rope over his shoulder that was pulling the mule along. "Catch up at the tavern this evening?" Chris shook his head. I can't tonight." Jack let the rope fall to his side again. He looked questioningly at his best friend. "Why not?" Chris stood there for a silent moment, trying to think of a substitute for the real answer. "It's like you said," Chris finally responded. "Mr. Elpert has that ball and chain on me. I'm going to need to make up all the work I'm missing right now." "At night?" Jack questioned with a raise of the eyebrows. "Mm-hmm," Chris hummed affirmatively, unable to bring himself to say anything beyond that to confirm his absolute lie. Jack picked up the rope again. "All right, Kris Kringle," he said in a somewhat irritated tone. "You enjoy filling those buckets with milk tonight. I'll be filling buckets of a different kind at the tavern if you finish your chores and wish to join." Jack called out to his mule and began making his way toward the castle, the ice wagon clunking along behind him. Chris sighed. He wished he could tell his friend the true story, but even Chris did not know yet what that whole story was. He would hopefully find out tonight. It was nighttime. The kingdom was quiet, and Calico Village beamed warmly with the light of fire from within each of its small homes. Chris's cottage was smaller than most. It was located toward the edge of the village and at the base of a large hill that overlooked all the homes. Silver Bells Cemetery was just a short walk from his home, and Chris would often spend quiet moments there in his free time, just thinking. Mr. Elpert, despite the way Chris and Jack had joked about him, was a kind old rancher. He knew Chris to be an exceptionally hard-working young man, and therefore did not punish or pester him when he arrived late in the afternoon to finish his day's work. Chris had never before been late for his duties. Today was different, of course. Today had been very different. Chris left his home after eating his humble dinner of ham and pea stew. He ate a little less of it than he usually did. He was excited and a little nervous to be seeing Rudy Chesterton tonight. Will he believe my story? Chris thought to himself as he walked down the dirt path that led him out of the village. The moon was mostly full that night, so that Chris could see clearly where he was going. But then again, he knew the layout of the kingdom so well, he could have made it to Chesterton Ranch without a full moon or lantern. It was fall, so the weather at night had a chill to it, enough for Chris to wear a light coat. The crunch of the dirt under his boots and the chirping of crickets were the only sounds to be heard. Chris arrived at the ranch and stood for a moment outside the Chestertons' home, located near its entrance. He took a deep breath and gave a moderate knock on the wooden door. He could hear the soft creaking of the wooden floorboards as someone inside began walking toward the door. It was opened a few seconds later by a particularly large man with a graying mustache and a round, cherry-colored nose. "Good evening, Mr. Chesterton," Chris said warmly. "Rudy," the man corrected him, gesturing to Chris for him to step inside. Chris nodded his appreciation and entered the home. It was well lit and warm. The dining table stood before Chris in the entryway, with a fireplace to the left and a staircase leading upstairs to the right. "I'm just finishing my dinner," Rudy explained as he made his way back to the table. "You'll have to excuse my wife, who is preparing to retire for the evening. Can I get you anything?" "No, thank you," Chris said as he sat down at the table across from Rudy. Rudy returned to eating the steak that lay half-eaten on his plate. "Sam told me you wanted to meet with me tonight, but didn't say why," Rudy began, covering his mouth with a napkin as he chewed. "It's Chris, right?" "Yes, sir," replied the guest. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. I won't steal much of your evening tonight. I just have something urgent I must share with you." Chris reached into his vest pocket and removed the note that had been secured there all afternoon. "If I said this note was given to me for you by Princess Ava, would you believe me?" Rudy was about to take another bite of steak when he paused to look up at Chris and then at the note in his hand. For what seemed like a minute, Rudy said nothing as he stared at his guest. "The princess, you say?" came the eventual reply. Chris nodded. "This afternoon. She seemed to mistake me for someone else, but insisted I bring the note to you right away. Said it was very important that only you saw it." Rudy slowly reached out his hand as Chris placed the note in it. "And am I the only one to have seen it?" Rudy questioned. Chris smiled. "I promised Her Majesty I would deliver it to you without looking at it." Rudy sat back in his chair. "Am I the only one to have seen it?" he repeated. "I'm a man of my word, Mr. Chesterton," Chris stated simply in a slightly defensive tone. "Only you have seen it." The rancher nodded his head with satisfaction. He opened the note and read its contents to himself. Again, Chris sat there in what seemed a long stretch of silence. "Did she give you any other information or direction?" Rudy asked, looking up from the note. Chris rubbed one of his fingers as he thought. "She was purposely reserved in what she told me," Chris answered. "All I know is that she wanted me to get you that note." Rudy looked again at the message in his hand, and then carefully placed it in the pocket of his pants. "Well, Chris, I'm grateful you did just that." He stood up from the table, and Chris followed suit. "You sure I can't get you anything for the road?" Chris shook his head. "I'm good, thank you." Rudy opened the door and extended his hand for a shake. Chris grabbed it in a firm grasp and then stepped out into the autumn night. One more thing, Chris remembered as he turned around. The princess mentioned something about the shepherds needing to decipher whatever it is that's included in that note. Does that mean anything to you? Rudy looked up at the stars in the night sky. "Chris, I'm afraid I can't tell you whether that means anything or not," he admitted. Chris nodded and turned around to make his exit from the ranch. "I mean, I can't tell you that tonight," Rudy added, as Chris paused in his exit. This time, Chris did not turn around, but merely looked back halfway to show Rudy he was listening. "But if you were to show up at the green pasture tomorrow night, you would get your answer." And with that, Rudy closed the door.